In a world where darkness rules and ancient bloodlines determine fate, one woman's rejected blood would spark a war that would shake the very foundations of the supernatural realm. What happens when the most powerful vampire king in existence tastes blood so pure, so extraordinary, that it terrifies him into rejection? What happens when that same blood calls to his greatest enemy, creating a bond that defies every law of nature? This is the story of Elena Blackwood, a woman who never knew she carried the rarest bloodline in supernatural history, a bloodline so powerful that vampire kings would kill for it, werewolf alphas would die protecting it, and ancient prophecies would finally come to pass because of it. When Lucian Drackle, the feared vampire king of the Eastern Territories, first tasted her blood during what should have been a simple feeding, he experienced something that hadn't happened in his 1,000 years of existence: fear. The power that coursed through her veins was so overwhelming, so dangerous to his carefully constructed world order, that he did the unthinkable. He rejected her, cast her aside, and declared her unfit to be in his presence. But blood calls to blood, and power recognizes power. What Lucian feared and rejected, his sworn enemy, Kieran Shadowmere, embraced. The bond that formed between Elena and the mysterious leader of the underground would not only change her life forever, but would set in motion events that would determine the fate of all supernatural beings. This is a story of rejection and acceptance, of fear and courage, of how one woman's extraordinary blood would bring down a kingdom and raise up an empire. This is the story of how sometimes the very thing that makes you powerful is the thing others fear most about you. Elena Blackwood pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the alley, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the creature stalking her could hear it from blocks away. The autumn rain had turned the narrow passage into a maze of shadows and reflections, each one potentially hiding the death that pursued her. She clutched her bag tighter, the research papers inside now seeming insignificant compared to staying alive. The sound of footsteps echoed off the wet pavement, measured and confident. Her pursuer wasn't running. He didn't need to. Elena had learned enough about vampires in her research to know that when they hunted, they preferred the chase to last just long enough to get the blood pumping. Fear, she had read, added a particular flavor that some of them craved. She never should have been out this late. The university library had kept her past midnight again, diving deep into folklore and mythology for her doctoral thesis on European supernatural legends. The irony wasn't lost on her that her academic interest in vampires was about to become a very real and very deadly encounter. A figure materialized from the shadows at the end of the alley, tall and imposing. Even in the dim light, Elena could make out his aristocratic features, the way he carried himself with an authority that spoke of centuries of command. His dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. When he smiled, the glint of fangs caught the light from the distant street lamp. "Dr. Elena Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "The scholar who has been digging so diligently into our kind's history." Elena's throat went dry. He knew who she was. This wasn't a random attack. Someone had been watching her, studying her research, waiting for the right moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," she managed to say, though her voice betrayed her fear. The vampire laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Please, Doctor. Your research into the Drackle bloodline has been quite thorough. Perhaps too thorough for your own good. Drackle." Elena's mind raced. In her research, she had found references to an ancient vampire family that had ruled the Eastern European territories for over a millennium. The text spoke of a king whose power was absolute, whose very presence could command lesser vampires to kneel. But those were just legends, stories passed down through generations of folklore. "You're him," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Lucian Drackle." His smile widened, showing more of those deadly fangs. "I am honored that my reputation precedes me, even in academic circles. Though I must say, your papers paint quite an unflattering picture of my rule."
Elena's legs felt weak.
She was face to face with a creature of legend, a being whose existence she had studied but never truly believed in. The vampire king himself stood before her, and from the look in his ancient eyes, he wasn't here for a scholarly discussion. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Want?" Lucian began to circle her slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "What I want, dear doctor, is to understand why a mere human has managed to uncover secrets that my own kind have kept hidden for centuries. Your research has revealed bloodline connections, territorial disputes, and power structures that even some of my own subjects are unaware of. Elena pressed herself harder against the wall. It's just research. Historical analysis. I never meant to expose anything that should remain hidden. Oh, but you have, Lucian said, stopping directly in front of her. And now I must decide what to do about it. Without warning, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron, cold and unyielding. Elena tried to pull away, but she might as well have been trying to move a mountain. Please, she gasped. I'll destroy the research. I'll never publish anything about vampires again. Lucian tilted his head, studying her with eyes that seemed to look straight through to her soul. You misunderstand, Doctor. It's not your research I'm concerned with anymore. It's you. Before Elena could ask what he meant, she felt the sharp pain of fangs piercing her wrist. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a combination of agony and something disturbingly close to pleasure. She felt her blood being drawn out, could hear Lucian drinking with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. But then something unexpected happened. Lucian suddenly jerked back, releasing her wrist so violently that Elena stumbled and fell to her knees. When she looked up, the Vampire King was staring at her with an expression of absolute horror. What are you? He whispered, his voice filled with something Elena had never expected to hear from a creature of such power. Fear. Elena clutched her bleeding wrist to her chest, confused and terrified. I don't understand. What's wrong? Lucian took several steps backward, his eyes never leaving her face. Your blood, he said, his voice barely audible. What flows in your veins should not exist. I don't know what you're talking about, Elena said, struggling to her feet. I'm just human. There's nothing special about me. Nothing special? Lucian's laugh was harsh and bitter. Child, what flows through your veins is power older than my bloodline, purer than anything I have encountered in 1,000 years of existence. You carry the blood of the ancients. Elena stared at him in bewilderment. The ancients. I don't know what that means. Of course you don't, Lucian said, his initial fear giving way to cold calculation. You're just a human scholar, stumbling blindly through forces beyond your comprehension. But that blood, that impossible, dangerous blood. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with eyes that seemed to be weighing her very existence. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with disgust. You are unfit, he declared. Unfit to carry such power. Unfit to exist in my world. That blood should flow in the veins of royalty, not some insignificant human academic. The words hit Elena like physical blows. She had just learned that she was somehow special, that her blood carried some kind of ancient power, and this creature was telling her she was unworthy of it. I never asked for any of this, she said, anger beginning to replace fear. I never asked to be special or powerful or whatever you think I am. No, Lucian agreed. You didn't. Which is precisely why you are unfit to possess it. He turned his back on her, preparing to leave. Consider yourself fortunate, Dr. Blackwood. I could kill you where you stand and drain every drop of that extraordinary blood from your body. Instead, I am showing mercy. Mercy? Elena's voice cracked with emotion. Yes, Lucian said without turning around. I am allowing you to live with the knowledge that you are nothing more than a vessel for power you could never hope to understand or control. You are unworthy of what flows in your veins, and you always will be. With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Elena alone in the alley, with a bleeding wrist and a shattered sense of self. She had spent her life studying legends and folklore, never imagining she would become part of one. Now she knew the truth about vampires, about ancient bloodlines, and about herself. But most importantly, she knew that somewhere in the darkness there was a vampire king who feared what she carried in her veins, even as he rejected her as unworthy of it. Elena made her way home through empty streets, her mind reeling with questions. What were the ancients? Why was her blood so special? And if Lucian Drackle, one of the most powerful vampires in existence, was afraid of what she carried, what did that mean for her future? She didn't know it yet, but her encounter with the Vampire King had set events in motion that would change not just her life, but the entire supernatural world. In rejecting her as unfit, Lucian had made his first mistake in centuries of careful rule. And in the underground where the rejected and the rebel gathered, someone else had been watching. Someone who would see in Elena's rejection not a condemnation, but an opportunity. Someone who understood that the very blood Lucian feared might be the key to bringing down his empire. The bond that would form between Elena and the mysterious leader of the underground would prove that sometimes the greatest power comes not from those who claim to be worthy of it, but from those who are told they never will be. As Elena cleaned her wounds and tried to process what had happened to her, she had no idea that her life as she knew it was over. The woman who had entered that alley was gone, replaced by someone who carried in her veins the power to reshape the supernatural world. All she needed now was someone who would see her not as unfit but as the key to everything. 3 weeks had passed since Elena's encounter with Lucian Dracul, and her life had become a careful balance of paranoia and research. She had thrown herself into studying the ancients, desperate to understand what made her blood so special and so feared. Every shadow seemed to hide potential danger. Every sound in her apartment building made her freeze with terror. The wound on her wrist had healed remarkably fast, leaving only a faint scar that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Elena could swear she felt something moving through her veins, something that definitely hadn't been there before the Vampire King had tasted her blood. Her research had yielded frustratingly little information. References to the ancients appeared sporadically throughout various texts, but always in fragments, as if someone had deliberately obscured their history. What she could piece together suggested they had been the original supernatural beings, the source from which all others had descended, but their bloodline was supposedly extinct, wiped out in some great war that had taken place millennia ago. Yet here she was, apparently carrying their power in her veins. Elena was walking home from the university library, taking a different route each night to avoid establishing patterns, when she noticed the woman following her. At first, she thought it might be paranoia, but after 3 turns and 2 deliberate detours, there was no doubt. Someone was tracking her movements with professional precision. Unlike Lucian's stalking, which had been designed to inspire fear, this pursuit felt different, protective almost. The woman maintained a careful distance, never getting close enough for Elena to see her face clearly, but always staying within range to intervene if needed. Elena decided to test her theory. She ducked into a 24-hour diner and ordered coffee she didn't want, positioning herself where she could watch the street through the window. The woman appeared moments later, taking a seat at a bus stop across the street with a clear view of the diner's entrance. For the next hour, Elena sat nursing her coffee and studying her mysterious guardian. The woman was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She moved with the fluid grace of a fighter, and when their eyes met briefly through the window, Elena saw intelligence and compassion rather than threat. When Elena finally left the diner, the woman was gone. But as she turned down the street toward her apartment, a voice spoke from the shadows of a nearby doorway. Dr. Jobmed. Blackwood? My name is Maya Chen. I represent some people who would very much like to speak with you. Elena spun around, her heart racing. The woman from the bus stop stepped into the light, her hands held out in a gesture of peace. Please don't be afraid, Maya said. We're not like Lucian Dracul. We're not here to hurt you or judge you. We're here to help. Help me with what? Elena asked, though she was beginning to suspect she knew the answer. With understanding what you are, Maya replied, and with staying alive long enough to fulfill your potential. Elena studied the woman's face, looking for signs of deception. All she saw was sincerity and something that looked like hope. Who are we? Elena asked. Maya smiled. We're the ones who refuse to kneel. The ones who believe that power should serve justice, not just maintain control. We call ourselves the Underground, and our leader has been very interested in meeting you since word spread about your encounter with the Vampire King. Word spread? The supernatural community is smaller and more connected than you might think, Maya explained. When someone as powerful as Lucian Dracul tastes blood and reacts with fear, news travels fast, especially when that someone declares the person unfit to carry what flows in their veins. Elena felt a familiar sting of rejection at those words. Even among people who apparently wanted to help her, her unworthiness was the defining characteristic of her encounter with Lucian. Maya seemed to sense her thoughts. For what it's worth, our leader thinks Lucian's fear had nothing to do with your fitness and everything to do with his own insecurities. Ancient power has a way of exposing the illegitimacy of those who claim to rule by right of strength alone. Your leader? Elena asked. Who is he? Someone who understands what it means to be rejected by those in power, Maya said. Someone who has built something beautiful from the ashes of that rejection. Will you come with me? I promise you'll be safe. Elena looked around the empty street, thinking about her lonely apartment and the constant fear that had become her companion. Whatever these people wanted from her, it had to be better than hiding in the shadows and wondering when Lucian Dracul might change his mind about showing mercy. All right, she said. I'll come. Maya led her through a maze of back streets and hidden passages that Elena never would have found on her own. They descended into what appeared to be an abandoned subway tunnel, but as they walked deeper underground, Elena began to hear the sounds of life. Voices, music, and the general hum of a thriving community. The tunnel opened into a vast underground space that took Elena's breath away. What had once been a subway station had been transformed into something that looked like a cross between a medieval Great Hall and a modern community center. Shops and cafes lined the platform level, while living spaces had been carved into the walls above. Gardens grew under artificial sunlight, and the sound of running water suggested a sophisticated infrastructure. "Welcome to Haven," Maya said, watching Elena's amazed expression. "Home to everyone the surface world has rejected." As they walked through the community, Elena saw beings that defied easy categorization. There were vampires, certainly, but also people who might have been werewolves. Others who seemed to shimmer with otherworldly energy, and some who looked entirely human but carried themselves with a grace that suggested hidden depths. "How many people live here?" Elena asked. "About 3,000, Maya replied. "We've been growing steadily for the past 50 years, ever since our leader founded this place. He believes that supernatural beings shouldn't have to choose between serving tyrants like Lucian Dracul or hiding in isolation." They made their way to the center of the community, where a building that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of stone rose several stories high. Maya led Elena up a winding staircase to a set of ornate doors. "He's waiting for you," Maya said, then stepped aside. Elena pushed open the doors and found herself in a room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in an enormous fireplace, and comfortable chairs were arranged around a low table set with tea service. A man stood with his back to her, looking out through a window that offered a view of the thriving community below. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the firelight. When he turned to face her, Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. He was beautiful in a way that seemed almost inhuman, but not cold like Lucian had been. His eyes were a deep green that seemed to hold depths of compassion and intelligence, and when he smiled, Elena felt something in her chest flutter in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Elena Blackwood," he said, his voice warm and rich. "I'm Kieran Shadowmere. Welcome to Haven." Elena found her voice with some difficulty. "Maya said you wanted to meet me." "I did," Kieran said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Though I'll admit my motivations aren't entirely altruistic. You see, Elena, may I call you Elena? You represent something I've been hoping to find for a very long time."
"Which is?"
"Hope," Kieran said simply. "Hope that the old ways don't have to be the only ways. Hope that power can be used for something other than oppression and fear." Elena settled into one of the comfortable chairs, accepting the cup of tea that Kieran offered her. "I still don't understand what makes my blood so special. My research into the ancients hasn't yielded much useful information. That's because most of the information was deliberately destroyed," Kieran said, taking a seat across from her. "The current power structure depends on the myth that strength determines legitimacy, that those who rule do so because they are naturally superior to those they govern. And the ancients challenged that myth? The ancients were powerful, yes, but not in the way modern supernatural beings understand power," Kieran explained. "Their strength came from connection, from their ability to bridge different kinds of energy and create harmony rather than dominance. They didn't rule through fear, they led through inspiration and service." Elena felt something stir in her chest, a resonance with words that felt like truth. "But they're extinct." "Their civilization is extinct," Kieran corrected. "But bloodlines have a way of surviving, even when they're dormant for millennia. You, Elena, carry the essence of what they were." "Lucian said I was unfit to possess such power." Kieran's expression darkened. "Lucian fears you because you represent everything his rule is not. Where he uses power to control and intimidate, ancient blood seeks to heal and unite. Where he demands submission, you inspire partnership. He called you unfit because admitting your worthiness would be admitting his own inadequacy."
Elena set down her teacup, her hands trembling slightly.
"What does this mean for me? What am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" "That," Kieran said gently, "is entirely up to you. But I hope you'll consider staying here, at least for a while. There are people here who can teach you about your heritage, help you understand and develop your abilities." And he paused, and Elena saw something vulnerable in his expression. "And?" she prompted. "And I would very much like the chance to know you better," he said. "Not because of what you carry in your veins, but because of who you are.
Your research shows a brilliant mind. Your courage in the face of Lucian's rejection shows strength of character.
And your willingness to come here tonight shows an open heart. Elena felt warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her encounter with the Vampire King.
For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel afraid or alone. "I'd like that too," she said softly. As if in response to her acceptance, Elena felt something shift in her blood, a warming that seemed to reach out toward Kieran. To her amazement, she saw his eyes briefly flash with silver light, and she realized that whatever was happening between them was affecting him as well. "The bond," Kieran said, wonder in his voice. "I hoped it might be possible, but I didn't dare believe." "What bond?" Elena asked, though she thought she might already know.
"Ancient blood calls to compatible souls," Kieran explained. "It seeks partnership, connection, the kind of unity that creates strength greater than the sum of its parts."
"What you're feeling, what we're both feeling, is the beginning of something that could reshape everything we know about supernatural power." Elena looked into Kieran's eyes and saw her own hope reflected there. For the first time since learning about her heritage, she didn't feel like a burden or an anomaly. She felt like she had found her place in the world. "Then let's see where this bond takes us," she said. Kieran smiled, and Elena felt the warming in her blood intensify, reaching out to embrace this man who saw her not as unfit, but as exactly what the world needed. Elena had been living in Haven for 2 months, and each day brought new discoveries about herself, her abilities, and the mysterious bond that seemed to grow stronger between her and Kieran. The underground community had welcomed her with a warmth she had never experienced in the surface world, treating her not as a curiosity or a vessel for ancient power, but simply as Elena. Her training had begun almost immediately. An elderly woman named Lydia, who claimed to have traces of ancient bloodline herself, worked with Elena daily to help her understand the energy that flowed through her veins. It was nothing like the violent, dominating power that most supernatural beings wielded. Instead, it felt like sunlight, like growing things, like the force that connected all living beings. "Stop trying to control it," Lydia instructed during their morning session in the garden chamber. "Ancient power doesn't respond to force or will. It responds to harmony, to balance, to love." Elena closed her eyes and let her awareness sink into the warm pulse of energy in her chest. Instead of trying to direct it, she simply opened herself to it, let it flow where it wanted to go. Immediately, she felt the plants around her respond, their growth accelerating, their colors becoming more vibrant. "Better," Lydia said approvingly. "Now extend that feeling toward another person, someone you care about." Without conscious thought, Elena's awareness reached out for Kieran. She found him easily, his presence like a beacon in her mind. The moment their energies touched, she felt a rush of emotion that wasn't entirely her own. His concern for the daily governance of Haven, his affection for the people under his protection, and underneath it all, a deep and growing love that took her breath away. The connection flowed both ways. Through their bond, Kieran felt Elena's wonder at her developing abilities, her gratitude for finding acceptance, and her own blossoming feelings for him. The exchange was so intense that Elena gasped and opened her eyes, breaking the connection. "The bond grows stronger," Lydia observed with a smile. "Soon, you won't need to reach for each other consciously. You'll simply be connected. Always." That evening, Elena found Kieran in his study, reviewing reports from the various scouts who kept watch on supernatural activities throughout the region. His expression was troubled, and Elena could feel his tension through their strengthening bond before she even entered the room. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his desk. Kieran looked up from the papers, his green eyes dark with concern. "Lucian is mobilizing his forces. Our scouts report increased vampire activity throughout his territory, and he's been calling in favors from allied supernatural factions." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think he's planning to attack Haven?" "I don't know," Kieran admitted. "But something has him spooked, and given that his last encounter was with you, I'm concerned that his fear has turned to decisive action." Elena stood up and began pacing, her mind racing. "Maybe I should leave. If I'm the source of his concern, my presence here puts everyone in danger."
"No," Kieran said firmly, rising from his chair to stop her restless movement.
"Eleanor, you're not the problem. You're the solution. How can you be so sure?" Kieran took her hands in his, and Elena felt the warm pulse of their connection intensify. "Because I've seen what you can do. Your power doesn't destroy, it creates. It doesn't divide, it unifies. Lucian fears you because he knows that what you represent could end his 1,000-year reign of terror. Elena looked into his eyes and saw absolute conviction there. But I'm still learning to control it. I'm not ready for a war. Then we'd better accelerate your training, Kieran said softly. Over the next several weeks, Elena's education took on a new urgency. Lydia introduced her to other teachers, each with their own understanding of ancient power and its applications. She learned to sense the emotional states of others, to project calm and peace into chaotic situations, and most importantly, to strengthen the bonds between herself and those around her. The connection with Kieran deepened beyond anything Elena had thought possible. They could sense each other's presence across Haven, share thoughts and emotions without speaking, and when they worked together, their combined abilities seemed to amplify exponentially. It was during one such joint training session that they made a discovery that would change everything. They were practicing defensive techniques, with Kieran channeling his own considerable power, while Elena learned to harmonize with and redirect hostile energy. But when their abilities merged, something unexpected happened. The energy didn't just combine, it transformed into something entirely new. Elena felt power flowing through her that was unlike anything she had experienced before. It was warm and brilliant like sunlight, but with an underlying strength that could move mountains. Through their bond, she felt Kieran experiencing the same transformation. His normally shadow-based abilities had become something radiant and healing. "What is this?" Elena breathed, staring at her hands, which were literally glowing with soft golden light. Kieran's eyes were wide with wonder. "I think," he said slowly, "we've just discovered why ancient bloodlines bonded with others. It's not just about companionship or partnership. It's about evolution." Their moment of discovery was interrupted by Maya bursting through the training room doors, her face pale with urgency. "We have a problem," she announced. "Lucian's forces have surrounded the surface entrances to Haven. They're not attacking yet, but they're demanding that we hand over Elena." Elena felt a transformed power immediately begin to fade as fear crept in. "How many?" "Over 200 vampires plus werewolf allies and some things our scouts couldn't identify," Maya reported. "Lucian himself is leading them." Kieran moved to Elena's side, his hand finding hers. Immediately, she felt strength and determination flow through their bond, steadying her nerves. "Gather the council," Kieran ordered Maya. "Emergency session in 10 minutes. The council meeting was tense, with various faction leaders arguing about the best course of action. Some wanted to fight, others advocated for negotiation, and a few suggested that Elena should consider turning herself over to prevent a massacre. Elena listened to the debates with growing frustration. These people had welcomed her, protected her, taught her to understand her abilities. The idea that she would repay their kindness by allowing herself to be used as a bargaining chip was unthinkable.
"There's another option," she said finally, her voice cutting through the arguments. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "I go out there and face him," Elena continued. "Not to surrender, but to show him what ancient power really means when it's used properly." "Absolutely not," Kieran said immediately.
"Elena, you're not ready for direct confrontation with someone as powerful as Lucian."
"Maybe I'm not," Elena agreed. "But we are."
She turned to face him, extending her hand.
"You felt what happened when our abilities merged. That wasn't just power amplification, that was transformation. Together, we might be able to do something that changes this entire conflict." Kieran stared at her for a long moment, and Elena felt his internal struggle through their bond. His desire to protect her warred with his recognition that she might be right. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it together. No matter what happens." "Together," Elena agreed. The preparations took place quickly. Word spread throughout Haven that their leaders were going to confront the Vampire King, and people gathered to offer support and encouragement. Elena was amazed by the loyalty and affection these people showed, not just to Kieran, but to her as well. As they made their way toward the surface, Elena felt her nervousness growing. This was so different from her first encounter with Lucien. Then, she had been helpless, ignorant of her own nature. Now, she understood what she carried in her veins, and she had Kieran beside her. But understanding and preparation didn't guarantee success. "Whatever happens up there," Kieran said as they reached the final tunnel leading to the surface, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the greatest privilege of my existence." Elena turned to face him, seeing her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," he replied, and their bond flared with an intensity that made Elena's entire body glow with soft light. They emerged from the hidden entrance to find themselves surrounded by creatures of shadow and menace. Vampires lined the rooftops, werewolves prowled the streets, and things that defied easy description lurked in every doorway. In the center of it all stood Lucian Dracul, exactly as Elena remembered him, arrogant, powerful, and radiating cold authority. "So," Lucian said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them, "the unfit little human emerges from her hiding place, and she brings the rebel prince with her. How touching." Elena felt Kieran's anger spike through their bond, but she squeezed his hand, sending calm and purpose in return. "I'm not hiding anymore," Elena called back. "And I'm not the same person you rejected in that alley." Lucian's expression shifted to one of mild interest. "No? Then show me what you think you've become." Elena took a deep breath and opened herself fully to the power in her veins. But instead of trying to wield it alone, she reached out through her bond with Kieran, inviting him to join with her completely. She felt his initial hesitation, then his complete trust and love as he opened his own power to merge with hers. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. Light blazed from both of them, not the harsh glare of magical power, but something warm and alive that seemed to breathe with its own consciousness. Elena felt her awareness expand to encompass every living being in the area, friend and foe alike. Through this expanded consciousness, she could sense the fear and confusion of Lucian's forces, the hope and determination of Haven's people watching from hidden places, and most shocking of all, the deep uncertainty and loneliness that lay at the heart of Lucian's ancient soul. "This is what ancient power truly is," Elena said, her voice somehow reaching everyone present despite being spoken at normal volume. "Not domination, not control, but connection, understanding. The recognition that we are all part of something larger than ourselves." She felt Kieran's wonder and love amplify her own certainty as she continued. "You called me unfit because you couldn't imagine power being used for anything other than ruling over others, but that's not what this is for." The light emanating from Elena and Kieran began to expand, reaching out to touch every person present. Elena felt the various supernatural beings' surprise as the energy washed over them, not attacking or coercing, but simply offering them a taste of what true unity could feel like. Some of Lucian's forces began to lower their weapons, confusion and curiosity replacing their aggressive postures. Elena could feel their amazement as they experienced, perhaps for the first time in their long lives, what it felt like to be connected to something loving rather than fearful. But Lucian himself remained unmoved, his expression shifting from interest to cold fury. "Enough," he snarled, and Elena felt the Vampire King gathering his power for an attack that could shatter mountains. The real test of what she and Kieran had become was about to begin. The power that erupted from Lucian Dracul was like nothing Elena had ever experienced. It crashed against her and Kieran's merged consciousness like a tsunami of darkness, carrying with it the accumulated rage and dominance of 1,000 years of unchallenged rule. For a moment, Elena felt their connection waver under the sheer force of his assault, but then something extraordinary happened. Instead of trying to match Lucian's power with equal force, Elena found herself instinctively doing what Lydia had taught her. She opened herself to the attack, not to surrender to it, but to understand it. Through their bond, she felt Kieran's initial confusion, then his amazed realization as he followed her lead. Together, they didn't resist Lucian's power. They absorbed it, transformed it, and sent it back as something completely different. Where Lucian's energy had been cold and dominating, what returned to him was warm and accepting. Where his power sought to crush and control, theirs offered understanding and connection. The Vampire King staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock as his own transformed energy washed over him. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice carrying a note of something Elena had never expected to hear from him: uncertainty. "Showing you what you could be," Elena replied, her voice still carrying that strange quality that reached every consciousness present. "Showing all of you." The light emanating from Elena and Kieran began to pulse with a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of life itself. Elena could feel it reaching out to every supernatural being present, not forcing them to feel anything, but simply offering them a glimpse of what existence could be like without the constant struggle for dominance and submission. Among Lucian's forces, Elena sensed growing confusion and wonder. Many of these vampires had been made during times of violence and desperation, transformed by masters who saw them as tools rather than beings worthy of respect. They had spent decades or centuries in rigid hierarchies where power meant survival and weakness meant destruction. The concept of connection without domination was foreign to them, but undeniably appealing. She felt several of Lucian's vampires begin to step back from their aggressive positions, their weapons lowering as they struggled to process what they were experiencing. A few of the werewolf allies were actually sitting down, their usual territorial aggression replaced by something approaching peace. But Lucian himself was far from peaceful. The Vampire King's fury intensified as he watched his carefully controlled forces begin to waver. With a roar of rage that shattered several windows, he launched himself directly at Elena and Kieran, moving with speed that turned him into little more than a blur of deadly intent. Elena felt Kieran's protective instincts flare through their bond, his own considerable power rising to intercept the attack. But Elena had a different idea. Instead of meeting Lucian's assault head-on, she wrapped both herself and Kieran in a cocoon of ancient energy, and simply waited. Lucian's attack struck them with the force of a meteor, but instead of causing destruction, it was absorbed into the sphere of light surrounding them. Elena felt his power adding to theirs, his rage being transmuted into something that felt like desperate longing, his need to dominate becoming a desire for genuine connection. "Stop this," Lucian snarled, pulling back and preparing for another attack. "You don't understand what you're playing with. That power doesn't belong to you." "It doesn't belong to anyone," Elena replied, stepping forward despite Kieran's protective tension. "That's what you've never understood, Lucian. Ancient power isn't something to be possessed or hoarded. It's something to be shared." Elena felt Kieran's love and trust flowing through their bond as she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months ago. She reached out with her consciousness, not toward her allies, but toward Lucian himself. She offered him the same connection she shared with Kieran, the same unity she had been showing his forces. For just a moment, she felt Lucian's mental barriers waver. Through the brief contact, Elena glimpsed the Vampire King's true nature, the crushing loneliness of immortality, the weight of centuries spent ruling through fear because he had forgotten any other way to exist, the deep pain of a being who had once been human and had lost all memory of what genuine connection felt like. But the moment of vulnerability lasted only seconds. Lucian's mental walls slammed back into place with such force that Elena staggered, and his expression became one of absolute fury. "You dare," he whispered, his voice carrying the promise of death. "You dare to pity me." He raised his hands, and Elena felt him gathering power unlike anything he had displayed before. This wasn't just his personal abilities. He was drawing energy from his vampiric bloodline, calling on the combined strength of every vampire he had sired over the centuries. "Lucian, don't!" called out one of his own lieutenants, a vampire Elena recognized from her research as Marcus Aurelius, one of Lucian's oldest and most trusted allies. "This isn't what we came here for." Silence. Lucian snapped, not taking his eyes off Elena and Kieran. "This abomination threatens everything we have built. She must be destroyed before her poison spreads further." Elena felt the various supernatural beings around them taking sides. Some of Lucian's forces were clearly having second thoughts about the conflict, while others remained loyal to their king out of fear if not genuine devotion. Behind her, she could sense the people of Haven emerging from their hiding places, ready to defend their home despite being vastly outnumbered. "This doesn't have to be a war," Elena called out, addressing not just Lucian but all the assembled supernatural beings. "We can find another way." "There is no other way," Lucian replied, his power reaching a crescendo that made the very air around him crackle with dangerous energy. "There are those who rule and those who serve. There are those who are strong and those who are prey. You seek to destroy that order, and for that you must die." He unleashed everything he had gathered, a focused beam of vampiric power that could have leveled a city block. Elena felt Kieran move to shield her, his own abilities rising to meet the attack. But Elena had learned something important about her power in the past few months. It was strongest not when used defensively, but when used to heal and connect. Instead of trying to block or deflect Lucian's assault, Elena opened herself completely to their bond and reached out with all the love and trust she felt for Kieran. She felt his surprise, then his understanding, as their connection deepened beyond anything they had experienced before. The transformation was immediate and profound. Elena felt her individual consciousness merge completely with Kieran's, their separate selves becoming something new and unified. The ancient power in her veins exploded outward, but instead of being hers alone, it became theirs, together. The light that erupted from their joined forms was like a star being born. It met Lucian's attack not with opposing force, but with such overwhelming love and acceptance that his power simply ceased to exist. Elena felt the Vampire King's assault dissolve harmlessly in the face of energy that sought not to conquer but to understand, not to destroy but to heal. But the real shock came when the light continued expanding, reaching out to touch every supernatural being present. Elena, now existing in perfect unity with Kieran, felt their consciousness encompass the entire battlefield. She experienced the thoughts and feelings of hundreds of beings simultaneously, understanding for the first time the vast loneliness and fear that drove so much supernatural conflict. Through this expanded awareness, Elena realized that the war between different supernatural factions wasn't really about territory or dominance. It was about beings who had forgotten how to connect with each other, who had built barriers of fear and aggression because they no longer knew how to trust. She felt Lucian's power structures begin to crumble as his vampires experienced genuine unity for the first time in their undead existence. Some were terrified by the sensation, clinging desperately to the familiar hierarchy they had known, but others embraced it with wonder, finally understanding what they had been missing all these centuries. Even Lucian himself was affected. Elena felt his mental barriers weakening under the constant pressure of love and acceptance. For brief moments she glimpsed the man he had been before centuries of isolation and power had turned him into the creature he was now, but old patterns died hard. With a roar of denial, Lucian marshaled his remaining forces, calling on every vampire, werewolf, and dark creature still loyal to him. "Destroy them all," he commanded. "Kill everyone in Haven. Show them the price of defying the natural order." Elena felt the moment stretch like a breaking point. Everything they had worked for, everything they had discovered about the true nature of ancient power hung in the balance. The choice before them was simple: use their abilities to fight back and prove Lucian's point about power being about domination, or find a way to transform this conflict into something else entirely. Through their perfect connection, Elena felt Kieran's understanding and agreement. Together they made the decision that would change the supernatural world forever. Instead of fighting back, they opened themselves completely to every being present. Not just their allies, not just the uncertain members of Lucian's forces, but everyone, even Lucian himself. The sensation was overwhelming. Elena felt her consciousness expand to encompass hundreds of individual minds, each with their own fears, hopes, anger, and longing. But instead of being lost in the chaos, she found that the ancient power within her was designed for exactly this kind of connection. It didn't just link minds, it helped them understand each other. For the first time in supernatural history, every being present experienced what it felt like to be someone else. Lucian's vampires felt the hope and community spirit of Haven's residents. Haven's people experienced the deep loneliness and fear that drove supernatural aggression. Werewolves felt the vampiric hunger for connection disguised as dominance. And everyone felt Elena and Kieran's absolute certainty that there was a better way to exist. The effect was immediate and profound. Weapons began dropping as beings who had been ready to kill each other moments before suddenly understood their enemies as people rather than threats. Ancient grudges began dissolving in the face of genuine empathy. But the most dramatic change was in Lucian himself. Elena felt his mental barriers collapse completely as he experienced, through the unified consciousness she had created, what true leadership could look like. For the first time in centuries, the Vampire King felt what it was like to be part of something larger than himself, something based on love rather than fear. The transformation would not be instant or complete. Centuries of isolation and dominance-based thinking couldn't be undone in a single moment of connection. But Elena felt the seed of change take root in Lucian's consciousness, and she knew that the supernatural world would never be the same. As the unified consciousness began to fade, returning each being to their individual awareness, Elena felt a new understanding settle over the assembled crowd. They had all experienced something that would haunt them in the best possible way. The knowledge of what existence could be like if they chose connection over conflict. The war was far from over, but the terms of engagement had changed completely. And at the center of it all, Elena and Kieran stood transformed, their bond now serving as a bridge between worlds that had been separate for far too long. 6 months had passed since the confrontation that changed everything, and Elena could barely recognize the world around her. The supernatural community had undergone a transformation so profound that historians would debate its implications for centuries to come. The unity consciousness that she and Kieran had shared with hundreds of beings that night hadn't been a temporary experience. It had planted seeds of change that continued to grow and spread throughout the supernatural world. Vampires who had spent centuries in rigid hierarchies were discovering the joy of genuine companionship. Werewolf packs were forming alliances with former enemies, and beings who had hidden in isolation for generations were emerging to join communities based on mutual support rather than mutual fear. Elena stood in what had once been Lucian's throne room, but which now served as a council chamber for the new unified territories. The cold marble and intimidating architecture remained the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where once there had been silence broken only by the whispered fears of supplicants, now there was the warm buzz of genuine discussion and collaboration. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been resistance from supernatural beings who preferred the old ways, conflicts between those who embraced the new unity and those who saw it as weakness, and the enormous practical challenge of rebuilding political and social structures that had been based on dominance for millennia. But Elena had learned that ancient power wasn't just about connection. It was about growth. Every challenge the supernatural community faced became an opportunity to develop new ways of relating to each other, new systems of governance, new approaches to conflict resolution. Kieran entered the chamber, his presence immediately noticeable to Elena, through the bond that had only grown stronger over the months. Their connection had evolved beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. They could share thoughts and emotions across vast distances, combine their abilities seamlessly for complex tasks, and most remarkably, they had discovered they could extend their bond to others on a temporary basis, allowing them to mediate disputes and facilitate understanding between conflicting groups. The Northern Territories have agreed to the new accords, Kieran reported, settling into the chair beside Elena's at the curved table that had replaced Lucian's imposing throne. That makes unanimous acceptance across all supernatural communities. Elena felt a warm glow of satisfaction through their bond. The accords represented months of careful negotiation and collaboration, establishing principles of mutual respect, shared governance, and peaceful conflict resolution that would govern supernatural society going forward. "What about Lucian?" Elena asked. "Any word from his retreat?" The former vampire king had withdrawn from public life after the Night of Unity Consciousness, retreating to a remote monastery where he was apparently undergoing what could only be described as a spiritual transformation. The being who had ruled through fear for 1,000 years was learning to exist as part of a community, following rather than leading, serving rather than commanding. "Brother Marcus visited him last week," Kieran said, referring to the former lieutenant who had become Lucian's primary connection to the outside world. "He says the changes continue to deepen. Lucian spent 3 days last week working in the monastery garden, apparently fascinated by the idea of nurturing growth rather than controlling it." Elena shook her head in wonder. If someone had told her a year ago that the fearsome vampire king would become a contemplative gardener, she would have thought they were insane. But she had learned that transformation was possible for anyone willing to open themselves to it. A soft chime indicated that the afternoon council session was about to begin. Elena and Kieran rose as representatives from various supernatural communities began filing into the chamber. The diversity of the council would have been unthinkable under the old system. Vampires, werewolves, feyfolk, human magic practitioners, and beings from a dozen other supernatural lineages, all working together as equals. The agenda for today's session included reports from the integration committees, discussions about expanding the Unity Consciousness training programs, and planning for the first annual Festival of Connections, an event designed to celebrate the diversity and growing harmony of the supernatural world. Elena found herself thinking about how different her life had become from those quiet days in the university library. Her doctoral research on European supernatural legends seemed quaint compared to her current role as one of the architects of a new supernatural society. But in many ways, her academic background had prepared her perfectly for the work she was doing now. Understanding the historical patterns that had led to centuries of conflict had been essential to designing new systems that could prevent those patterns from repeating. As the council session began, Elena felt the familiar warm pulse of the enhanced consciousness she shared with Kieran. Together, they facilitated the discussions, helping to bridge differences of opinion and find common ground between vastly different perspectives. Their bond had become a stabilizing force for the entire community, a living example of what unity could accomplish. The first report came from Dr. Paba. Sarah Chen, Maya's sister, who had taken charge of the integration programs helping newly created supernatural beings adapt to the new way of existence. Under the old system, new vampires and werewolves were often abandoned after their transformation, left to figure out their new nature on their own, or handed over to masters who saw them as property. The new approach emphasized education, support, and community integration. "We've successfully integrated over 300 new supernatural beings in the past month," Dr. Chen reported. "The support networks are working well, and we're seeing much lower rates of the violent episodes that were common under the old system." Elena felt a surge of pride through her bond with Kieran. This was exactly the kind of practical change that their unity consciousness had made possible. Instead of treating transformation as a traumatic break from humanity, the new programs helped beings understand their changed nature as an expansion of what they had always been. The next presentation came from Thomas Brightwater, a Fae representative whose people had been in conflict with vampires for centuries. Under the old system, such cooperation would have been impossible, but the unity consciousness experience had allowed different supernatural species to understand each other's perspectives in ways that had never been possible before. The territorial disputes in the western forests have been completely resolved, Thomas reported with obvious satisfaction. Instead of competing for hunting grounds, vampire and Fae communities are working together to maintain the ecosystem balance. We've actually seen an improvement in both magical and biological diversity. Elena marveled at how often she heard reports like this. Problems that had seemed intractable under the old system of dominance and competition were finding elegant solutions when approached with understanding and collaboration. But perhaps the most significant presentation of the day came from Elena herself. She stood to address the council, feeling the supportive presence of Kieran through their bond. "I'm pleased to announce that the ancient bloodline research has yielded extraordinary results," she began. "We've identified 17 individuals across the global supernatural community who carry dormant ancient genetic markers." A murmur of excitement ran through the chamber. Elena had been working with a team of supernatural genealogists and magical researchers to understand how ancient bloodlines had survived throughout history.
What they had discovered was that the power wasn't as rare as they had initially believed. It had simply been dormant, suppressed by centuries of conflict and separation.
More importantly, Elena continued, we've developed protocols for safely awakening these dormant abilities.
Each of these individuals has the potential to form bonds similar to what Kieran and I share, creating a network of unity consciousness that could eventually encompass the entire supernatural world. Through her connection with Kieran, Elena felt his excitement and love, amplifying her own sense of wonder at what they were building together. The vision that had seemed impossible just months ago was becoming reality. A supernatural world united not by fear or dominance, but by understanding and genuine connection. The remainder of the council session was devoted to practical planning. How would they approach individuals with dormant ancient abilities? How would they ensure that the awakening process was safe and consensual? How would they prevent the new network from being used as a tool of control rather than liberation? These were complex questions without easy answers. But Elena had learned to trust in the collaborative process. The diversity of perspectives in the council meant that problems were examined from every angle, solutions were tested against multiple value systems, and decisions were made with broad consensus rather than autocratic decree. As the session concluded, Elena felt a familiar presence approaching through the bond networks that now connected much of the supernatural community. Maya appeared in the doorway, her expression bright with news. "Elena, Kieran, you need to see this," Maya said, practically bouncing with excitement. They followed Maya to the communication chamber, where a large crystal array allowed for long-distance magical communication with supernatural communities around the world. The crystal was currently displaying an image of a bustling city that Elena didn't immediately recognize. "This is New Tokyo," Maya explained. "The supernatural community there has been following our model, and they've achieved full integration in just 3 months. Vampires, werewolves, yokai, and human magic practitioners are working together so seamlessly that they've actually become a model for the human city government." Elena stared at the image in amazement. The integration of supernatural and human communities had been a distant goal, something they hoped might be possible in the far future. To see it happening so quickly exceeded their most optimistic projections. "How many other cities are following similar patterns?" Kieran asked. 17 so far," Maya replied. "And the number is growing every week. The unity consciousness model isn't just transforming supernatural society, it's creating bridges between our world and the human world that could change everything." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she contemplated the implications. When Lucian had rejected her in that dark alley, declaring her unfit to carry ancient power, she had felt worthless and alone. Now, less than a year later, that same power was helping to heal divisions that had existed for millennia. Through her bond with Kieran, she felt his thoughts echoing her own amazement. Neither of them had expected their connection to become the catalyst for such massive social change. They had simply followed their hearts, trusted in their love for each other, and remained open to the possibilities that their bond created. "There's something else," Maya added with a grin. "We received a message from the monastery where Lucian has been staying." Elena's attention focused sharply. They had been carefully monitoring the former Vampire King's progress, partly out of concern for his well-being, and partly because his transformation was seen as a symbol of how profoundly the supernatural world could change. "He wants to meet with you both," Maya continued, "not as a former ruler requesting an audience, but as someone who has something he wants to share." Elena exchanged a look with Kieran through their bond. The last time they had seen Lucian, he had been a broken figure, overwhelmed by the experience of genuine connection after centuries of isolation. The idea that he now felt ready for voluntary contact suggested that his transformation had progressed further than any of them had hoped. "When?" Elena asked. "He's requested that you visit the monastery next week," Maya replied. "He specifically asked that you come not as leaders or negotiators, but simply as the people who showed him that change was possible." Elena felt a warm glow of anticipation mixed with nervousness. Part of her would always remember Lucian as the terrifying figure who had rejected her and declared her unworthy. But she was also curious to see what kind of person he was becoming under the influence of genuine community and spiritual practice. "We'll go," Kieran said, his decision flowing through their bond to become Elena's as well. As they left the communication chamber, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a lonely academic, studying supernatural legends that she thought were just stories. Now she was part of a love story that was transforming the world. The bond between her and Kieran had grown beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. They were still individuals with their own thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, but they were also something new. A living example of what unity could accomplish when it was based on love rather than dominance. But perhaps most importantly, their bond had shown them that transformation was always possible. Lucian's journey from tyrant to contemplative gardener was just the most dramatic example of something that was happening throughout the supernatural world. Beings who had been trapped in patterns of fear and aggression were discovering new ways to exist.
Elena looked out through the tall windows of the former Vampire King's castle, now the heart of a growing network of connected communities.
In the distance, she could see lights from Haven, where the underground city had expanded to become a model for integrated supernatural society. Beyond that were the territories that had once been battlegrounds between rival factions, now home to collaborative communities that would have been unthinkable under the old system.
"What are you thinking about?" Kieran asked, his presence warm and comforting through their bond. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the thing that makes you different is exactly what the world needs," Elena replied. "Lucian called me unfit because my blood didn't match his idea of what power should look like. But that difference was exactly what allowed us to imagine a new way of using power." Kieran moved to stand beside her at the window, his hand finding hers. Through their connection, Elena felt his deep contentment and his excited anticipation for whatever came next. The woman who was rejected for being unfit ended up being exactly the right person to change everything, he said softly. Elena smiled, feeling the truth of his words resonating through their bond. Her journey from rejection to acceptance, from loneliness to connection, from fear to love, had become a story that was inspiring transformation throughout the supernatural world. As the sun set over the territories that were no longer divided by fear but united by understanding, Elena knew that their story was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still bridges to build between communities that had been enemies for centuries, still individuals who carried dormant ancient power waiting to be awakened. But for the first time in her life, Elena felt completely certain about her place in the world. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, with exactly the right person beside her, doing exactly the work she was meant to do. The Vampire King had called her unfit, but his enemy had bonded with her and shown her the truth. Sometimes the greatest power comes not from being deemed worthy by others, but from having the courage to define worthiness for yourself. And sometimes, when you find the right person to share that power with, you can literally change the world.